back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Beth Macy. She is a journalist and author of multiple books. Her latest book, Dope Sick: Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America, is out now. It chronicles the more than now 20-year history of the opioid epidemic. Beth, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
All right, let's start and I think this audience is fairly familiar with different aspects of this because we have spoken not just to journalists but to lawyers who are working on various cases going after this. But give us a sense of what are the numbers that we're talking about? Like when we talk about this as an epidemic, how many people, but for the development of, and I guess it's sort of hard to know this, but for the development and the prescription of them getting OxyContin, let's say, or any of the sort of like the other opioids that have been that have followed in its wake, what are the numbers of people who have become addicted?
Yeah, so this is the number that really kind of made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and also made me realize how fast overdose deaths are increasing. In the last 15 years, we've lost 300,000 people to drug overdose deaths, and we're going to lose that many more in just the next 5.
Wow.
And so I tell this story through the ground level, but if you go back to these distressed rural areas where people were being prescribed immediate release painkillers for workplace injuries, et cetera, especially in central Appalachia, you talk to doctors there, they have 1, 2, maybe 3 people that they were treating in the course of a year for drug dependence. And as soon as that drug came on the market, their practices just became overwhelmed with people, as did the jails, as did, being called out in the middle of the night to a drug overdose death for a child you had immunized as a baby, And so it really happened very quickly. What the book points out is that it took our nation so long to get a handle on it because it began in these politically unimportant places. And then when it moved to the cities and suburbs with, I feature this upper middle class suburb near where I live in Roanoke, Virginia. People were just so ashamed, and there was such a big stigma that they hid it from their neighbors that this was happening in their households.
All right, so and I want to get to that question of places and that evolution, but so just to be clear, and I think people need to understand this, there have been changes in the way these drugs are prescribed. There is a greater awareness among doctors about the implications of them, but the addiction epidemic is still growing, right? Like this isn't abating; it's growing, isn't it?
That's exactly right. Like I said, if you look at that number, it's just going with no sign of plateauing until, quote, sometime after 2020. And the thing is, even though doctors are now prescribing fewer opioids, and certainly I hope no longer prescribing for moderate pain, which was the big change that happened in the mid to late 90s when Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies were pushing this idea that was pain was being undertreated. And now it was, even though centuries of history indicated that morphine is always addictive, morphine-based products, now we're prescribing less, but we still have 2.6 million people with opioid use disorder. And we know, because we've studied what happens in these communities, that it's not a quick fix. John Kelly at Harvard says it takes the typical person who's addicted to opioids 8 years and 5 to 6 treatment attempts just to get 1 year of sobriety.
Wow. And, because I asked that question, I had occasion to talk to an attorney who was doing litigation against the McKessons, like the distributors, and he described it as it's like a snake eating a rat. Like this mass of people is going to go through the system, and we haven't even seen it crest yet.
We haven't, and if you look at all these children that are now being raised by grandparents and foster care. I mean, that's one of the things I'm learning as I went out and I did all this reporting for 2.5 years on this book, and now people are coming to my events and they're sharing other stories. And, I got a letter from somebody the week the book came out, she had been to my talk, my kind of book launch talk, and she runs a foster care nonprofit in the region. And she said last month we had 100 requests for foster care placement, largely due to people who've been orphaned by the opioid epidemic. She said we found homes for 7 of them. So what happens to the other 93? And what happens to these kids later in life? I mean, it's really a national disgrace, in my opinion.
Well, all right, let's talk about these places, because I think I remember a statistic on the number of children in foster care in Roanoke. It was extraordinarily high.
Yeah, and not even as bad as it is in these rural distressed communities. I mean, in Appalachia, it's as high as 50%.
Wow. All right, well, let's start. I mean, and it may not seem obvious, and you've touched on it just briefly, but about those initial hotspots, what were the hotspots? Like, if we were to track and watch it on sort of like an animated graph, and we would watch these places, tell us what we would see first and why, and then how it migrated.
Yeah. So you would first see it becoming a real problem with jails filling up and overdoses happening in these areas where factories were closing, where coal mines were shutting down, in places like Machias, Maine, where there was lots of logging and fishermen, places where there were lots of workplace injuries. So where people were already being prescribed immediate release opioids before OxyContin came out. And the thing Purdue Pharma did with OxyContin is they hired an army of reps, and they bought this data that showed them which doctors and which towns were prescribing the most immediate release opioids. So they knew who the competitors were and exactly who to target. So let's say you're Dr. Smith and you're practicing in Machias, Maine, and you have a lot of loggers who have been there, or fishermen who've had workplace incidents. You're going to get a call now from a Purdue rep, and this is mid to late 90s, who's preaching this notion that pain is being largely undertreated. And because we have this brand new time-release mechanism that allows OxyContin, a drug stronger than any that had prior been on the market, to allegedly bleed out over 12 hours, it's much safer. And the FDA allowed them to say the new time-release mechanism made it is believed to reduce the abuse for dependence and overdose. And so it was supposed to be safer. Addiction was, quote, exquisitely rare or less rare and only happened in less than 1% of cases. So this was a narrative being pushed in doctors' offices all across the country. Purdue hired 5,000 doctors, nurses, and pharmacists to become paid speakers, and they really did a full-on assault. But it starts out in these distressed areas because that's where there were legitimate workplace injuries. But if you look at the families that I profile in those areas, those folks have always been able to take, say, 2 weeks of Vicodin or Percocet for a simple workplace injury and then largely be finished with it and to the end of the course. The difference was, as a police officer put it to me, OxyContin turned a lot of people into non-functioning people because it was so strong. And a lot of people immediately figured out an end run around the 12-hour mechanism.
And so it was, I mean, it was both were a problem, right? Like that it was stronger than, it would zonk you out more than you anticipated. And
right,
even though
which sets you up for addiction.
Right, okay.
Better. Mm-hmm. And then they realized it because the jobs were going away. It was its own resource to be plundered. They could doctor shop, say you had lost your job in a textile plant, you could go to your doctor and say, my back's really giving me trouble. And because of this new narrative being pushed by Purdue and other opioid makers, the pain was undertreated and that OxyContin was safe now for moderate pain. I mean, that was the big thing.
Right.
You could go and say you had back pain, something that's hard to prove. They would write you OxyContin, and then you could sell it to your neighbors who were already addicted for $1 a milligram. So it became a way for people to pay their bills.
Right. And then, okay, so, and we see this in the data. We see these, towns in Appalachia or, towns in Maine that are hit, Ohio, that are hit, just devastated. And then where does it go? How does it migrate there? Is it just that the marketing campaign just expands?
Well, the marketing campaign was everywhere. I'm saying it becomes a problem earlier in these rural areas, which had never had, like, people left their doors unlocked. And, I remember a story early on, a guy making a night deposit for the grocery store that he managed was murdered as he was, making his deposit because somebody was addicted to OxyContin and needed money to go buy more. And that fear of dope sickness was creating this crime never before seen. I mean, that people are stacked up in the jail. One man traded his family's mule for 4 pills. So crime at that level had never before seen. But at the same time, these reps are going everywhere in the country, right? So it's just not becoming as well known in places that aren't as distressed. So it's happening in New York. It's happening where I live in Virginia, which is not a distressed region. Everywhere, it just doesn't really show up as a huge problem because the crime wasn't, changing the way it was in these truly distressed areas. So when it really kind of slaps people in the face where I live here in Roanoke is when a pair of local weathermen overdosed at a party, and it became local news, and everybody went, "What? Wealthy white guys?" And that was 2006. In 2010, you see a bunch of kids get caught trading or using and selling, because anyone who becomes addicted, many people who become addicted also start selling it in order to fund their own habit. A couple of private school kids get ensnared in this, and not just a couple, but a couple get caught. One dies. The other is about to go to prison for his role in his classmate's death. And I do a series, then a newspaper reporter in 2012, I do a series on this, and people are just like, what? Wealthy white kids are doing heroin? And of course, that was just the tip of the iceberg. The reason it was so slow becoming, people becoming aware of it in the cities and suburbs were the wealthier kids had the money to hide their addiction. They could say their iPad was stolen and their parents were buying a new one when really they had pawned it for drugs. And the parents who were in on the, quote, dirty little secret had the money to send their kids off to rehab, and they were too ashamed to tell their neighbors. So it was really this perfect storm in each location, but it just becomes, as the public becomes aware of it, the timing is different for that. And so the last locality I talk about in the book is a little idyllic farm town, which is not a distressed community in the northern Shenandoah Valley, which, has a twice convicted drug dealer lands, and there are already people who are addicted to pills, and he sort of brings heroin in bulk, and that town goes from having a handful of users to almost hundreds overnight. And so what I try to do in the book
that's Ronnie Jones, right?
How it's spread. Yeah, that's Ronnie. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to get into some individuals, but I'm fascinated by this because I'm also aware that the numbers of Latinos and African Americans who became addicted was lower because they didn't have access to health care. I mean, so it's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting that like there is a sweet spot on some level of that pushed this this addiction epidemic, where there was enough money to have access to medical care, but not enough to really to inhibit people. Like, in the wealthier areas, you're not going and pretending you have a back problem to sell to your buddies or your friends who are addicted because you have enough money to not do that. So so in that instance, the sort of like not complete poverty, but significant enough, it seems like, struggle to the middle class was an accelerant because the need for the money was there, but there was enough also to get initial access.
Right. You thought your money protected you, but in fact, it kind of did the opposite in this. There's just so many unintended consequences everywhere. But as you said, like in terms of getting addicted to pills, people of color were sort of predicted by good old-fashioned racism, right? Doctors didn't trust them not to overuse it, or they didn't have access to go to the doctor. But now you see numbers in people of color, overdose numbers in particular because of fentanyl, especially in the urban areas, in middle class Latino and African American men, overdose deaths actually being higher because they're coming out of jail at a rate higher than white people are, because they're going to jail at a higher rate. And many who were using before because they got no treatment in jail, they come out of jail and they go back to using what they were using before, only now it has fentanyl in it. And as someone said, if it's raining in the white community, it's a tsunami in the black community.
Wow.
So they're less likely to call 911 for police because they don't trust them, and they're less likely to have access to health care. So, of course, now there's just no demographic in America that's been untouched by this.
Let's just talk a little bit more about the marketing in the family that owned Purdue as the drivers of this. In 2000, the marketing budget was $4 billion. Is that right? I mean, I wrote that down in my notes, but I look at it, it doesn't seem correct to me.
That doesn't seem correct to me either. I think that might be a bit high. Where did you get that from?
Oh, I don't know. I thought I had taken.
Yeah,
it
I'm not.
from your
I'm
book.
not
Okay.
knowing the marketing budget off
Okay.
the top of my head, but certainly I quoted the marketing budget because I had access to it in the book, and it's correct in the book. But yeah, I mean, they spent a lot of money on marketing, and no, $4 billion would be way too much.
That seems extraordinary. I think I may have just written it down wrong.
Yeah. Between 06 and 15, the whole pharmaceutical industry, opioid makers spent almost $1 billion on lobbying and political campaigns. So think about that, and think about who you're voting for and whether or not they're accepting money from these opioid makers.
There was an attempt
that's the real
also,
thing.
I mean, I guess this was about a year or two ago, to change the guidelines for these distributors who are in between. Obviously, the manufacturers, the distributors have a statutory obligation to report any type of like blips, and they obviously saw different areas where, there are more pills going in than people. Out
of tiny Kermit, West Virginia. Yeah, Eric Geyer at the Charleston, West Virginia paper did some great reporting on that. Just Kermit, West Virginia, I think it had 400 some people, and I forget how many millions of pills went there in 1 year. I mean, just ridiculous, and no oversight at all.